Good evening, everybody. My name is David Casey. I'm a psychiatrist and geriatric specialist at Louisville, and I'm going to be talking about some tips on maintaining your brain with the aging process to maintain thinking and memory. And we will do our RSVPs for this talk. This is part of our Building Hope lecture series sponsored by Louisville's Depression Center. So, why do we have concern about memory? Why do people always want to know something about maintaining a memory process? Well, because there are more of us in the older age group. There are more older adults. We're living longer. You may have seen some things in the press in the past year suggesting that certain segments of American population are not living longer, but the group as a whole, our lifespan is increasing. And people who are born today can expect to live longer than people who are coming of age today. So our lifespans we can expect that people live longer. The biggest effect is the aging of baby boomers, because baby boomers are like the snake that swallowed the egg. It's just moving down, a great big mass of people that's moving down the age spectrum. And we're just moving into that group in which the baby boomers are now greatly expanding the number of older people. And that will continue to be true for the next 25 years or so. The group that's increasing most rapidly right now are what we sometimes call the oldest adult, those people 85 years of age and over, which were an uncommon group a generation or so ago, but now are quite common. So cognitive loss and dementia are major concerns in our society. Some people think that memory loss and dementia will be the major public health concern of this century. Mild memory loss is a normal part of aging. All of us experience a certain degree, but our memory typically peaks sometime at about age 30. And after that, if you put people through very elaborate psychological testing, you can discover that there's some loss of memory. Hopefully we compensate for that with the increase of wisdom and experience. But our memory function is sort of like our athletic function. It peaks at a certain period of time. Some people will experience a much more rapid and significant loss of memory with the aging process. Other people, although they have some loss, it's to a much lesser extent. And they're a very gifted group of people who continue to have almost the same cognitive level throughout life. And that's the minority of us. There's a lot of difference from person to person in terms of the degree of memory loss and the exact nature of the memory loss. Most all of us find that we have a loss of naming ability, coming up with the exact name for people, or sometimes the exact word for things. That's almost universal. And keeping more than one thing in mind at the same time becomes more difficult, and our speed of processing becomes slower as we get older, and that's almost always true. Most of us who are otherwise normal, however, we can eventually come up with a name or come up with the right answer. Our reasoning processes are not affected to the same degree that our memory processes are, but it takes longer. Normal memory loss, by definition, is not disabling. That is, we can continue to do our normal things. If we find that we cannot do our normal things, then we're suffering from something more than mild or normal age-related memory loss, then we're suffering from some kind of memory disorder. Dementia is a general term that we give to memory disorders, and all dementias fit into one category or another. There are about 50 different categories of dementia, but only a few of them are common, and it differs around the world. In the United States, or any kind of Western culture, Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. It accounts for somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the total cases. Vascular dementia, which has to do with circulation and stroke, or Lewy body, which is a relative of Parkinson's disease, are kind of neck and neck for the second most common form of dementia. And then Parkinson's disease itself can also be a source of dementia. And this group together are the most common form of dementia. You may also have heard of Pick's disease or frontotemporal dementia, and go further down on the list. So that's their normal pressure hydrocephalus and a lot of other things. Most forms of dementia go through a transitional phase where the person has mild memory loss greater than normal for their age, but not quite enough to be diagnosed as a dementing process. And this is sometimes called mild cognitive impairment. When we think about how to address memory problems, we can think about risk factors, things that tend to make us more likely to develop memory loss or maybe more likely to develop dementia. And we can divide those into controllable risk factors, some things you can do something about, and certain things that are not controllable, things that you have to live with. There's another important concept, and that's the concept of cognitive reserve. So if you imagine that a person is developing Alzheimer's disease, let's say, and they have those brain changes in which abnormal proteins like amyloid begin to accumulate in the brain, some people who are very educated or very intelligent or very gifted may be able to continue to function in spite of the presence of those proteins because they have a lot of reserve capacity. A little bit like an athlete who has maybe a lung disease or heart disease may function at a higher level than the average person in spite of having heart disease. It's true of brain function also. So cognitive reserve is something that is important to understand, and some of our strategies have to do with increasing cognitive reserve because we don't have any strategies that can remove abnormal proteins from the brain, but we can build up the healthy part of the brain in order to compensate. Most of the things that I'll talk about tonight that are based on scientific studies are based on what are called association or associational studies rather than cause and effect studies. Cause and effect studies are those in which an experiment is done. You take a group of people, give them a treatment, another group of people, and you don't give them a treatment, and you compare outcomes. When it comes to memory disorders that unfold over a very long period of time, it's almost impossible to do that kind of study. I won't say it's impossible because some people have done such studies, but they're very difficult. So most of the research that we have has to do with problem association. For instance, people who smoke are known to have lung cancer. That's an association. And we knew that for many years before we were able to prove that one caused the other. So most of the studies in memory are associational. That is, we can draw inference that two things occur together, they must be related. But that's not quite the same thing as proof. And so we have to take those kind of studies with a grain of salt. So what are some of the non-controllable risk factors that pertain to memory loss and dementia? Well, aging itself. So aging is not the cause of dementia, and many older people have perfectly normal brains other than maybe some mild memory loss, and they don't have dementia, but age is clearly a risk factor. You're more likely to get dementia when you're 90 than you are when you're 50. And the risk gradually increases through the later span of life. Genetics and family history are things we can't control. You should know, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, that genetics and family history are important, but they're not government. You don't inherit dementia or memory loss in the way that you inherit blue eyes or brown hair. You inherit a risk, and that risk may or may not be manifested in your particular case for lots of reasons, some of them having to do with the other risk factors we'll talk about. Declining general health, I put that as a non-controllable risk factor. You may develop diabetes or heart disease. But I also put it on a controllable risk factor because some aspects of declining health may be things that you could prevent or do something about. For instance, smoking would be an example. So possible controllable risk factors: declining general health, poor cardiovascular health, that might go in both categories, Obesity, people that have obesity, particularly people that carry their weight around the middle, are prone to develop a certain condition called the metabolic syndrome. And there are a whole host of things that go along with that: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high lipids, diabetes, and an elevated risk of stroke and heart attack. The same factors seem to mitigate for memory loss and dementia. Hypertension, of all the various medical aspects, diabetes and hypertension are probably the most important in controlling our risk for memory loss. And it turns out that you can't draw a line and say, okay, anybody with a blood pressure of 130 over 90 and above is at risk, and anybody below that isn't at risk. If you plot out the whole population, it turns out that there isn't any line you can draw. Basically, the lower the better for both blood sugar and blood pressure. Even people that aren't diagnosed with hypertension or diabetes, if they're at the lower end of normal, they tend to do a little bit better. And obviously, there are people with the extreme low end of normal, that's not so good, but except for those small number of people, the lower the better. Head injury is also a risk factor for memory loss and dementia, and we don't really have a really good handle on the exact sort of numerical parameters. We don't know how many blows to the head, or how many episodes of concussion, or how severe it has to be meaningful, but it's clear that there is an association. We know about pro football players. I have several ex-football players in my practice, and it's very difficult to sort out whether they have this condition of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that NFL players or other players are getting, or whether they have Alzheimer's disease, or maybe both, because they may be related disorders. But we know that head injury is an important factor. Elevated cholesterol and blood lipids are also important. It turns out that the overall picture of risk for memory loss is very similar to the overall picture of risk for heart disease. So things that are good for your heart are good for your brain. Things that are bad for your heart are bad for your brain. That's not true 100%, it's about 90%. By and large, if you want to protect your brain, you do the same things that you do if you want to protect your heart. There's an association between late life depression and dementia, but it's not been fleshed out yet. We know that people that have late life depression are more likely to get dementia. We don't know whether that's a cause or whether maybe it's just a symptom. Perhaps people who have early Alzheimer's disease, for instance, manifest that not only with memory loss, but also with depressive symptoms, in which case the cause might be going the other direction. But we do want to identify and treat people with depression in hopes that it might not only help the depression itself, but help the associated factors such as reduce the risk for dementia. What about family history? Family history of a memory disorder is a risk factor, and the closer the relative is genetically, and the more relatives there are, then the risk goes up. But once again, heredity is not destiny. If you look at certain conditions, diabetes is a good example. Type 2 diabetes runs in families, but you can't draw a clear chart that shows exactly what the mode of transmission is. It's more random than that. Same is true of dementia. The other thing about dementia is because you don't know what age it might strike. I'll give you an example. My mom, who's passed away, she used to let me use her as an example. She developed Alzheimer's disease when she was around 8, and she lived to be 93. Her siblings, for the most part, passed away in their 60s. We have no way of knowing what might have happened to them had they lived longer. And so when we draw our family tree, there are lots of gaps in it. And late life onset disorders are like that. It's very difficult to understand fully the genetics because not everybody lives long enough before the picture will unfold. And also because these generations unfold over such a long timeline that you almost never have complete information. And so we don't have a full understanding, but we think that there are factors having to do not only with an increased risk of developing the disease, factors that mitigate whether you might develop the disease sooner, and you're more likely to manifest it in your lifetime, or maybe you can do things that reduce your risk that would put off the risk for a period of time. And maybe, in a sense, you would outlive it. You would live out your normal lifespan with this risk present, but it would never manifest in your particular case because you did other things that tended to reduce the risk in other ways. And that's why genetics are not really destiny when it comes to late life disorders like dementias. There's a genotype that some of you may have heard of called the ApoE genotype. And the ApoE genotype comes in several varieties. One of those varieties, ApoE4, increases the risk of a certain kind of, well, not all kinds, but a certain kind of Alzheimer's disease. And you may have one copy or 2 copies, or you may have no copies available before. And your risk is proportionate to that. And if you're unfortunate enough to have 2 copies, then your risk is higher and you're more likely to develop the disorder earlier in life. At the moment, we don't routinely screen people for AOD because there's nothing we can do about it, and because it's not, the association is not so clear-cut as to make it worthwhile. But once again, we can modify these risk factors a little bit like if you have a family history of Parkinson's, then you really want to work hard on your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and so on. Exercise is a really interesting story. Regular exercise seems to reduce the risk of memory loss and dementia. And it turns out that the degree of exercise is not vast. You don't have to go out and run marathons or lift heavy weights or do strenuous exercise. People that walk on a regular basis seem to do better. As a matter of fact, it's hard to find a form of exercise that doesn't help. And so all kinds of exercise seem to be helpful. We're not clear on what dose. We think of dose as something related to medication, but we also think of dose with other things like exercise. You know, how many minutes a day or at what intensity is best. We don't know the answer to that. We do know that people who are active are better off than people who are not active. In both physical aging and also in brain aging. It's clear that activity in middle age is important, but it's never too late. There was a really interesting study that was done a couple of years ago. It took a group of people who had mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's disease, and they put them on an exercise regimen of moderate intensity, and they put them on the Mediterranean diet, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and they gave them a variety of kind of brain stimulation tasks. And that group of people did remarkably well. Many of them stopped getting worse, and some of them even got better. And we've never had a study like that before. Now, in the interest of fairness, not every study shows this. There are several studies that don't seem to show as much value. But I can't think of a good reason not to pay attention to this, because physical activity has its own rewards, and it's so good in so many other ways, and it seems likely that its useful in this world also. What about mental activity? People that have continuous learning, mental activity, clearly do better in maintaining memory and reducing the risk of dementia. This is especially true in learning new topics or skills, and especially novel tasks. I'll give you an example. So if you were to learn how to play, supposedly you played the piano and you practice every day, but you practice the same tunes all the time. That would be better than somebody that didn't do that. Let's say that you learned new tunes, you learned new songs. That requires a lot more brain power. You're practicing and building up brain power to a greater extent to do that than you would to play something that you already know. Let's suppose one day you decided you were going to learn how to play the clarinet or the guitar. That's a more novel task. And so the more novel the task is, the greater it enhances your brain power. The thing that's been the most studied, and this is a little bit controversial, all the details haven't been worked out, but it seems to be true. People that learn, who speak more than one language, that clearly builds up cognitive reserve. And so if you speak more than one language, it's never too late. So I just learned Spanish in the last few years, so I use it in my practice all the time. It's not easy to do this as an adult, but it is possible. I don't sound very good when I speak, but I can make myself understand. Now, it's also true that educational level seems to make a difference. That is, people that have more years of formal education have a reduced risk of dementia, but it doesn't last forever. It seems that people that have very long lifespans in those last few years of lifespan catch up. That is, that they develop, it's almost like they've got the brain changes, but they have such high cognitive reserve, they've forced all the symptoms. If they live a very long lifespan, eventually those brain changes will catch up with them. But they can put off the symptoms long enough that many people will sort of outlive the disease. What about commercial brain training programs? I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard. I don't put it in here so I don't get in trouble, but like Lumosity would be a good example. This is a delicate subject, and so I want to say it exactly right. There's a lot of general evidence that people that have enhanced mental activity, that is, they read, they do puzzles, they stay engaged socially as well as intellectually, reduce their risk of memory impairment. It's not so clear that one product that emphasizes a particular kind of skill building You certainly get better at those skills, but it's not so clear that it transfers to other things. If you pay close attention to Lumosity, they've changed their commercials in the last year. They don't make the same claims they used to. That's because the FDA sanctioned them for making false claims. And it turns out that probably there isn't a special kind of narrow focused thing you can do that is uniquely good. It's more a variety of things that seems to be helpful, rather than focusing too much on one particular thing. So you can certainly get better. If I were to give you a certain kind of Sudoku puzzle to do, you can practice at it and get better, but it's not so clear that that is carried on to other areas. And so the value of these commercial products is not really good proven. Now, there are some interesting academic studies looking at computer games. And they clearly, even in very elderly people, enhance reflexes and make reasoning faster. Whether they enhance memory, that's not so clear. What about diet? Well, I put it right at the top here. The best diet for brain health is what's called the Mediterranean diet. Anybody ever heard of the Mediterranean diet? Probably most of you have, right? So the Mediterranean diet is, we've got it on the next slide here. Fish, especially oily fish. So, like tilapia that they raise in a lake in Egypt, not so good. Very oily salmon, probably pretty good. And fish that are farmed have generally less omega-3 acids in them than fish that are wild caught. And so you want large, cold water, oily fish that are wild caught seems to have the best. One of the interesting things is if you supplement people with commercial omega-3, it does not seem to have the same impact. And there have been several studies that show a limited impact. As a matter of fact, supplements generally don't seem to work as well as we would like. But fish, olive oil, and I mean a lot of olive oil, not just a little bit, but a lot. I mean, people take tablespoons of it, and we think that fat's bad. In the case of olive oil, maybe not so much. Olive oil probably is very helpful. Small amounts of red wine or juices. This is very controversial. We'll come to that in a moment. Limited sugar and fats, especially artificial and trans fats. Limited red meat. And limited processed foods and emphasis on whole grains. That's the Mediterranean. What they call the Mediterranean diet, this is the diet that people would have traditionally consumed in the Mediterranean area, especially Sardinia, and maybe before McDonald's came and took over. So this is a traditional diet, and not so different probably in lots of places, but particularly those places. There are similar diets, also colorful fresh fruits and vegetables. There are similar diets that have been used in various medical studies for other purposes that are basically just clones of the Mediterranean diet that you can read about on your own. The DASH diet or the Lang diet that takes certain aspects of the Mediterranean diet and tweak them a little bit, but they're basically the same thing. What about alcohol? Well, some studies seem to indicate that small amounts of alcohol, especially red wine, may be helpful. More recent studies suggest that this may not be the case. And there's a substance in red wine, aside from alcohol, called resveratrol, that's been shown to be helpful with memory. The problem is you have to consume a very large amount of it to really have much of an impact. And so I'm a skeptic myself that alcohol has to be valued here. And certainly if I have people in my practice that want to adopt the Mediterranean diet and they don't drink, I don't tell them to start drinking red wine. Quite the contrary. I tell people that do drink, you'll be better off if you quit. Some people say, well, I just can't quit. I say, well, try to switch to red wine, and for men, no more than 2 standard pour servings a day, and for women, no more than 1. But I really would prefer it if you stopped altogether. Most people tell me they can't stop. I know they're drinking more than they're letting on. If they tell me they can't stop, even though the doctor tells them this is what you need to do to preserve your brain, that's a pretty powerful statement right there. People who use alcohol, there's no question whatsoever. There's a whole other set of brain disorders that have to do with excessive alcohol use. They'll all have an impact on memory. What about sleep? This is something that's come to our attention just in the last maybe 5 years. Numerous studies indicate that good quality sleep, quality and quantity, is associated with reduced risk of dementia and improved memory in normal aging, and probably tends to reduce your risk of dementia. In animal models, this is very powerful. Sleep seems to be a huge factor. We know that various components of sleep are necessary for us to process memory. For instance, remembering things that happen to us, it's necessary for us to have REM sleep to improve our skills, like learning how to play that piano. It requires deep sleep. And so disruptions of sleep have a very powerful negative impact on memory. And those who've experienced that, we know this to be true. Doctors in training, they put workout or restrictions on doctors some years ago. This has turned out to be controversial because there's certain things to be gained by getting calm. But people that are sleep deprived and fatigued clearly are going to be making poor decisions. And that's true not just at that moment in time, but it's cumulative over a lifetime also. One study suggested that those abnormal proteins that accumulate during Alzheimer's disease, particularly amyloid, tend to be cleared during sleep. And a lack of sleep, your brain is not given sufficient opportunity to clear those negative proteins, abnormal proteins. Other sleep disorders, especially sleep apnea, but not limited to sleep apnea, are also associated with dementia and memory impairment. Something like 50% of people with Alzheimer's disease have sleep apnea. Now, in this case, probably the cause and effect are going in both directions. The brain's disordered, that probably govern those aspects of brain function that govern respiration are also disordered. But people with sleep apnea can have a very large reduction in their oxygenation. So if you have this many hours during the night, this inspiration, this is not going to be good for your brain. What about personality and dementia? The type A personality is correlated with increased dementia risk. So people that have type A, that have high levels of cortisol in their systems, so kind of a fight or flight kind of a response, high levels of epinephrine in their system, and that probably is damaging to your brain over a long period of time. Conversely, a number of studies now suggest that meditation, which sort of like you accomplish the opposite of being a type A personality, including mindfulness, which is the kind of meditation that's being studied for lots of medical purposes now, is associated with improved memory and reduced dementia risk. Really interesting stuff. What about supplements? Well, there are so many supplements that it's hard to name them all, but I can summarize it. Many supplements have been devoted to aid memory or treat dementia, but none have passed rigorous scientific testing. So people ask me, like there was a lady that showed me a long list of supplements today. She said, what do you think? And I said, well, none of these are going to hurt you. I can't tell you that any of these are going to help you. So really, it's your choice as to what you want to do. Sometimes, though, people, there are certain kind of supplements that may interfere with a prescription medication or may cause problems with side effects. However, you may be using those to try to avoid taking prescription medication in a way that will in the end be unhelpful. They go in fads. 10 years ago, vitamin E was being promoted and turned out not to be as useful as we thought. There's another round of vitamin E testing that's about to get started. CoQ10 is widely prescribed by neurologists, still use it. Some suggestion it may be useful, but not a lot. Prevagen is sort of the thing of the year. Prevagen is the jellyfish extract, and the FDA also sanctioned the Prevagen makers for false claims. A couple of years ago it was coconut oil. If anything, coconut oil can make it counterproductive because it's very, very unhealthy kind of fat. So I can't really, in good conscience, recommend supplements, and I don't usually recommend supplements. I know some of my colleagues do. There was a time that I did, but I don't really anymore. I don't think the science is there to do it. So in conclusion, modification of diet, exercise level, and lifestyle may reduce the risk of dementia and lead to better memory function. Prevention of head injury is important. So that means if you're involved in an active sport, especially riding a bicycle or skiing, you need to wear a helmet. And if you're riding in a car, you need to wear a seatbelt. Those are the main preventable kinds of head injury. What's going to happen with athletics going forward? I'm a big fan. I love football and all sorts of other sports. I see lots of valuable sports, but unfortunately, every year I get a little more uncomfortable watching those guys take these hits. And I think, in the end, I can't see football surviving in its current form. It's going to have to change or go away. Even soccer is not that great. If you're heading the ball, if you head the ball in a game, it's probably not much impact. But in practice, where you're doing heading drills, you might do it 100 times in a row. That probably, and lots of youth leagues are already outlaw that. We might need to rethink our approach to sports and try to protect people from head injury. But at this moment, we don't know enough about it even yet to know exactly what the parameters are. Is there a safe limit? Is there an approach that's better? We don't know the answer to that yet. But we do know, particularly in my opinion, people that have early dementia, let's say the person in their 50s or 60s who's at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and they have a significant head injury, I think that really accelerates the process. I think in lots of cases like that. And so I think you should do what you can do to prevent that from happening. And once again, many of these observations are association awareness of cause and effect, and so we're not conclusive, but most of these have other well-established benefits. And particularly for me, as an example, since I have a strong family history of dementia, it's worthwhile to take these things into consideration. And I think that's all I have. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Coffee. You can see coffee up there is a way of strengthening the mind.
Say that one more time. Coffee. Well, coffee is a very complicated story.
I know. But it's
and every year, studies come out saying coffee is terrible, and new studies come out saying it's great.
Yes.
And the ones that say it's great are outnumbering the ones that say it's terrible about 2 to 1.
All right.
And so I don't know that coffee is something that I could recommend. I drink a lot of coffee. Coffee has caffeine and other similar things in it that clearly they increase your frontal lobe function and they sharpen your ability to concentrate. And that's why people use caffeine in the attempt to do that.
Sure.
They make you feel more awake. Whether it has an impact long-term in dementia, we don't know. Now, some of the prescription dementia drugs that work through a different mechanism, at least one of them has a caffeine-like effect in addition to its principal effect. And so stay tuned, maybe we'll be prescribing coffee one of these days. Other questions? Yeah?
Have they changed the view on calcium?
Calcium. So calcium is often prescribed for osteopenia or osteoporosis. Large amounts of calcium are pretty commonly taken for people that have that condition. There have been a couple of studies suggesting that large amounts of calcium are not good for you all the time. They may have negative effects, for instance, kidney stones, but they may enhance your risk of heart disease. They might be causing more calcium deposits in your arteries, for instance. So calcium, it's good to take if you have a good reason to take it, but it's not been shown to really be helpful for brain health. Now, if you have a calcium deficiency, there's a rare person who does, that's a different matter, but that's not so common. Other questions?
What about the statin drugs?
The statin drugs, that's another complicated question. Elevated cholesterol is clearly associated with an increased risk of dementia. There have been 1 or 2 studies suggesting that the statin drugs may have some negative effects aside from whatever they're doing to cholesterol that are deleterious in the brain. And so at this moment, there aren't any experts that are suggesting we should be avoiding statin drugs because the beneficial effects seem to outweigh the negative effects. But I think it's something we ought to be paying attention to. It's the same for certain drugs that are used to control stomach acid. There's a correlation between those drugs and dementia. No cause and effect. We don't know enough about it to change our practice yet, but it's something we're keeping a close eye on. Yeah?
I run into a lot of people that have been prescribed by their GP or their internist on Aricept to start with.
Yes.
Would you review the, just briefly, the overview of what you're looking at and treating people with these days? My mother lived to be 100 plus 7 months. One of the worst behaviors, but in a nursing home, medicated bed, I managed the care, minimal drugs, and used adrenergic type of antidepressant for her because they were not, I think she was beyond at one point treated the Dementia or Aricept would help.
So,
but I have seen so much bad medicine having her in that nursing home for 13 years. This was in West Virginia, the first dementia unit, and I was able to, affect some change there. But I mean, it's just very bad here in Louisville where I would expect better medicine.
So the question is, among several questions there, one of them has to do with
what you're
treatments that
treating
Aricept
with.
and so we don't have good treatments, medical treatments for dementia. There are 2 kinds of prescription drugs that are available today. One of them is the Aricept class. And as a class, these are known as cholinesterase inhibitors. There are 3 of these drugs that are currently prescribed. There's a 4th that we don't use anymore. And there are Aricept, which the generic is Nemazil. There's Exelon, and there's both oral and patch, but the oral's not used very much. And that's very distinctly. And there's Razanine, which is Colantamine. And these three drugs in the same category, they're not identical, but they're very similar to one another. They share the same basic side effects, for instance. The main side effects are GI effects. There are a few others, but that's the main one. So at one time, we had some thought that these may have some preventive value or value in mild cognitive impairment or normal age-associated memory impairment, or maybe even enhancing cognition for kids that wanted to study for a test or something like that. There's not very much evidence that that's true. Some studies are a little contradictory, but it seems as though that's probably not the case. And the best use of these medicines is for people that clearly do have dementia, especially Alzheimer's or Lewy body or Parkinson's dementia. And probably for frontal lobe dementia, not very helpful, maybe even counterproductive sometimes. People with vascular dementia, many of them actually have a mixed dementia. They have some Alzheimer's changes, and they also have vascular changes. And you might use a cholinesterase inhibitor for one of those people. A lot of times, we can't tell with an absolute 100% certainty which kind of dementia it is. We have a pretty good educated guess, but we're not right 100% of the time. So cholinesterase inhibitors have some value for people with mild to moderate degrees of dementia, primarily the Alzheimer's type or Parkinsonian-related dementias. And the greatest value is in the first 6 to 12 months. They probably have some value out about 4 or 5 years, but it's diminishing as time goes on. The value for most people is modest. There are individuals that get a lot out of these drugs, but on average, what you're trying to do is just slow down the symptom progression. And that's something that's impossible to completely measure in a given person. You can measure with groups of people. If I have 100 people and I put them all on Aricept, they're all appropriate candidates, and I have 100 other people that I don't put on Aricept, and I do psychological testing at intervals on these groups, I'll find a trend for the treated group to do a little better. But you find individuals that don't follow that trend in both groups. And so if somebody asks me, do you have a drug that might help my mom who's in this category, the answer is yes. They come back 6 months later, can you prove how much this is helping mom? The answer typically is no, I can't. A little bit like if you take cholesterol medicine and you don't have a heart attack, can you prove that you were gonna have one? No, you really can't. So we're betting the odds, basically. Namenda or Dementine, it works by a totally different brain circuitry, but its clinical effects are pretty similar. That is a mild effect to promote memory function and to forestall memory loss, but it's not doing it by curing the process deep in the brain. It's basically masking the symptoms for a period of time. You can combine the two medications, and sometimes we do that pretty commonly nowadays. When somebody reaches extreme old age or extreme level of dementia, then I tend not to use the medications. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to get the person off as many medications as I can. To sort of just speak to what you were talking about earlier, a palliative care approach is often helpful, in which you treat symptoms a person is having that affects their quality of life, but you try to calm down the overall number of medications and be more modest in your medical goals. And a lot of times, it's counterintuitive, but if you don't treat the medical problems quite as aggressively, the person actually feels a little better. And that's appropriate for somebody that's in the last few years of life. You can never know exactly what that is, but you can also make a pretty good educated guess there too. Yes?
Is there any advancement in diagnosing Alzheimer's? I know historically it's been that they cannot be diagnosed until after someone has passed away. Can they diagnose it now prior to?
So I think the answer is complicated, yes and no. So when I was in training, I was taught that Alzheimer's disease could only be diagnosed at autopsy after a person had passed away. Our skills in looking at the person's symptoms are so much better now than they were a generation ago that I can say with about a 90% likelihood of being correct whether somebody has Alzheimer's disease or not. It cannot be 100% because the symptoms overlap with other conditions, like Lewy body and Alzheimer's may in a particular person look exactly the same. And so there's always some level of inaccuracy. 90% is pretty good. And it takes a person who's very experienced to be able to reach that level of accuracy. And you know it's true because you can compare to autopsy studies.
Can you say without being accurate?
Well, let me finish. So, there are more advanced tests today that will help us make the diagnosis. The best example certain kinds of PET scans, for instance. The problem with those is that a certain number of normal people have amyloid in their central nervous system also. So those tests have not turned out to be perfect either. And we now know that amyloid is probably present for 10 years or more as the illness evolves before the person begins to develop symptoms. And so you can get a PET scan that's labeled with a particular kind of, it's not a dye, but it's something that makes the amyloid plaques in the brain light up and be visible on the scan. But that has not, it's very expensive and cumbersome to do, and we don't do it routinely because it just didn't turn out to be that much better than a careful clinical examination. So mostly that's restricted to research purposes. There are so many efforts to try to develop a better test. Blood test, urine test, eye tests, test of smelling, cerebral spinal fluid. All of these have certain merit, but none of them are really quite at the moment, at least not yet. What were we going to say?
Can you say that people that you see, patients that you see that have a higher degree of arteriosclerotic heart disease and or any kind of heart disease have a greater incidence of dementia?
They do. There's no question about it. And it's not just vascular dementia. It's vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease also.
Because my mother, I diagnosed vascular.
Yes, both.
They all just
vascular risk
lump
factors.
everybody into the whole same basket.
Vascular risk factors are recorded for both Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. As a matter of fact, that's led us some to maybe rethink a little bit what the boundaries between these two conditions can be, because they seem to overlap.
And my follow-up question is, why do they not? I know you have your basic format that you have to follow, because that's what you're told to do and have to do. But I'm looking at Dr. Esselstyn, who's been here twice. That's the doctor from that is Bill Clinton's doctor who helped reverse a lot of his bad eating and heart disease management. He's been here twice. He was the cardiologist at U of L. They all saw, and I saw his slides and everything. They're remarkable about the proof in the association with a plant-based, holistic, organic, plant-based diet. There are over 100 people from his group here at Louisville exposed. Many of them had their heart disease reversed, or at least the symptoms have changed, the labs have changed. And they go out to dinner, and they have influenced about probably 60 to 70 restaurants here. They're cooking according to their likes.
So your question really has to do with vegan, plant-based diets and whether that is helpful in reducing the risk of dementia. And the answer is that we don't know.
Well, he's done studies on all of this.
Well, the problem is that there are lots of studies that show that and a lot that don't show that. And when you have a champion for treatment like that, you have to be a little careful with the studies they do because they inadvertently game the studies. It probably is true that for a subset of people, extreme low-fat diets are the best choice. When you look at the population as a whole, the whole nutrition world is turned on its head by this. Large studies don't show that. As a matter of fact, there was a study of extreme low-fat diets that came out just about a week ago that showed those people have higher mortality. They have better conditions for heart disease, but they die of everything else. So what if you gain? And so we don't really know the answer.
Well,
For somebody that we know has heart disease,
yeah,
that probably is a good measure, but whether it's a good measure for everybody, we don't really know. Like if you go to France or Italy where people are eating, cream and cheese every day, they have a lower heart rate than we do, or heart disease rate than we do, and they live longer.
I've been reading up on Fat for Fuel, that's Mercola's book. He's read around the world, and it does seem to help me feel better, the ketogenic diet.
See, I think that's the issue. I'll give you a good example. So years ago, I gained a lot of weight, and I tried losing weight. It was hard, and so I was trying various things. My wife suggested, it's right over there, that I should try the Atkins diet. And let me tell you, I lost weight like it was going out of style. It was so easy. Other people said it made them feel terrible, and they didn't lose any weight. Nowadays, I think that the key is probably going to be to find out how one person is different from another, and what kind of nutrition is good for this person and their particular metabolic style and background. It may not be the same for everybody. And so for Bill Clinton, as an example, somebody who's been eating cheeseburgers all of his life and was way overweight and already had heart disease, that was the perfect thing for him. Whether you can prescribe that for everybody, I think probably looking at personalized medicine in the future, where you try to match a particular person's metabolism and background with nutritional approach that's best for them, and I think that's what we haven't been able to achieve consensus.
And also what they're willing to do, you know,
I mean, it's not easy to follow around like that. You have to be really motivated. I got tired of that exactly. It was too narrow for me. I couldn't keep doing it. And probably wasn't good for me to keep doing it anyway.
Does B12 deficiency?
So people with B12 deficiency, B12 is a vitamin that's found in green leafy vegetables, and it's found in other places, limited amounts even in animal products. And people who are low in B12, you can be low in B12 for one of two reasons. Either it's insufficient in your diet, and most people with low B12 that are mildly low, that's the reason. Or you lack an enzyme in your stomach that's necessary for you to absorb B12. And that causes profound loss of B12, and it leads to changes in your blood products. And that's called pernicious anemia. That's the less common but more severe type. You can correct the first kind by giving supplements of B12. You cannot correct pernicious anemia by giving supplements. You have to give that enzyme that's lacking in order to correct the problem. Or you give injections of B12. So for people that are low in B12, treating it is a useful thing. Most of us are not low in B12, certainly in the United States, but some people are. There's another related issue, though, that has to do with the interaction between B12 and folic acid and the product that appears in the bloodstream as a result of that called homocysteine. And there does seem to be a correlation with elevated homocysteine levels in the bloodstream and a risk for dementia. And there are various measures you can do, dietary measures and others, to address that if that's the case. Once again, is that a proven fact? No. Is it an interesting theory that some people have adopted? Yes.
I will be at my doctor's store, the doctor tomorrow for physical, and I will ask him to do my homocysteine level, because I've done it for over years.
Yeah, well,
Because of the heart disease.
homocysteine, for heart disease,
It's cheaper than
inflammation, there are various markers of inflammation, some things that some people think about whole body inflammation is important, right?
It is.
You had a question?
Yeah, what about people that have been treated at one point for hyperactivity using drugs? What is?
There's no known connection between hyperactivity, that is attention deficit disorder hyperactivity, and stimulants and developing dementia later in life. As a matter of fact, there's a study that just came out today using Ritalin to try to treat apathy in people with Alzheimer's disease. And so, there's a vast discussion about whether that's a good thing or not a good thing and the pros and cons of it, but it doesn't seem to have any link to dementia that people can think of. I'll tell you an interesting story though. So I've got this group of very elderly people that I see. A remarkable number of people come to see me and they say, doc, I think I've had ADD all my life and it never got treated, and I'd really like you to treat it for me. And I'm throwing out my hands because there's no literature on this. There's nothing that tells me how to go about diagnosing or treating an 80-year-old with self-diagnosed, undiagnosed ADD. So one of these days I'll have to figure out the answer to that and write a book about it because I don't know what the answer is. But it's a common complaint.
Thank you very much.